Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count.
Welcome back to Deer University. Bronson and I are here today with a really special episode, I think, Bronson, for a couple of reasons.
Yeah, what are those couple reasons?
Well, one is anybody that follows the MSU Deer Lab social media platforms knows this guy, Luke Resop.
Oh, yeah.
One of our star MSU Deer Lab graduate students who's been here for about 3 years, and he's like kind of the Stephen Curry, the James, the LeBron James of our program. He does everything. He's good on defense. He's good offense. He drives. He draws fouls. He does it all. And so for our program, he does a lot of our social media stuff. And being, shall I say, the younger of the three, he's more able to outreach to social media platforms and much better than, say, one of us would be able to do.
Yeah, he's better than me, and he's a lot better than you.
Good deal.
No dispute there. Yeah,
nailed it on the head. But he's came to us from Virginia, Pennsylvania, then Virginia, and he's been a real joy to have here. And he's a habitat guy. He loves plants, and he's been involved in some research here for his master's work, looking at the effects of fire, prescribed fire, on plant communities. And, our ultimate interest there is how do the plant communities affect deer? So that's the cool thing here is we get to talk about a management technique that affects forests, timber stands, and wildlife. And Luke, you want to give us a quick little context of why understanding prescribed fire and how it impacts plant communities is important?
Yeah, I think there's been growing awareness in the last few years, just kind of from what I've gleaned on, our social media page and what people are talking about. I think there's growing awareness of the importance of plants. I think for a long time, deer managers were just like, they're there and deer need them, but I don't really need to have an in-depth knowledge of why they're important. But I mean, if you think about it from a deer's perspective, they eat plants. That's where they get their sustenance. They bed in plants. They drop their fawns in plants. They evade predators in plants. Everything in a deer's world is tied to plants. So, I'm, like you said, a habitat guy. That's kind of what I'm fired up about, so to speak. But it's really about the plants to me. And it's not, I do like just being out there and enjoy identifying and understanding plant communities. But at the end of the day, for me, it's a better way to understand deer and deer management. As far as why that's important in our context, thinking about prescribed fire, here in the Southeast, if you look at the history of fire really across the United States, but especially here in the Deep South, these plant and wildlife communities they're intrinsically tied to fire. There are certain plant communities that are not fire adapted, but there are more of them here than there are just about anywhere else in the United States, just because we've got long growing seasons. The weather here is very conducive to fire. And if you look at, kind of a historical time scale over the last hundreds and thousands of years, most of our fires were happening in the growing season. They're happening between May and late July to early August. And that, not coincidentally, coincides very well with peak lightning season. So from a historical perspective, most of our fires were being lit by lightning strikes, and they were burning across the landscape until something stopped them. And I guarantee you that was not a fire break that was put in by a bulldozer. It was a river or a cliff or an embankment, or a low spot in the woods where the vegetation was wetter and the soil was wetter, and they would just burn. So we've got lightning strikes, and those fires were on average burning across the landscape every 2 to 6 years, primarily in the growing season. And then we've got Native Americans who we cannot, I don't think, looking back and kind of thinking about this from a historical perspective, we can't separate Native Americans from natural fire ignition sources. Our plant and wildlife communities have been here for thousands of years. Native Americans were here for thousands of years before we ever got here, and they were using fire on the landscape. And our wildlife and plant populations are just as adapted to Native American fires as they were lightning strike fires. But, when we think about lightning strikes, that was growing season. Native Americans, on the other hand, they were lighting fires at all times of the year, whether it was winter, spring, summer, fall, whenever. If the conditions were right and they could use fire to meet their objectives, they would. And those objectives included everything from wildlife management to agricultural preparations to war tactics. And when the conditions were right, they burned. So that's kind of the big picture. Over the last thousands of years, fire is an intrinsic part of this landscape. And the critters here in the deep south, in today's context, white-tailed deer, are extremely dependent on disturbances like fire to maintain the plant communities they use for various things. Like I said, dropping fawns, eating, evading predators, etc.
As you were listing those reasons Native Americans would burn, Luke, there was one that popped into my mind. If I'm living in the woods 24/7, 365, I'm going to, and this is maybe personal bias, but I don't like ticks in particular, and I'm not a big fan of mosquitoes, and fire can be a component of minimizing some of those issues too. So I would just throw that in as one more reason Native Americans might have burned to help control tick populations.
Absolutely.
Well, Luke, let's get going here on, I guess, your research. So you've had a couple projects here. And in terms of you being a jack of all trades, you're also a part-time movement ecologist as well. So you've been working on some buck movement research and publications as well. So multi-talented fellow you are. Let's kind of get into, I guess, the framework of our research and research you've led. Let's talk about what are the impacts from more of a traditional timber management perspective and dealing with the undesirable species in terms of the understory and growing into the midstory. What have you learned as being an optimal time and frequency of fire to keep those dang sweet gum seedlings under control?
In general, and there's a lot of variation here with which species we're talking about, because one of the cool things in my mind that some of our latest research has uncovered is that different species respond differently to different fire seasons. So sweet gum you brought up, for example, a June fire, so we're talking the kind of mid-growing season time frame, 3 months after spring green up, a June fire is going to most effectively reduce sweet gum stem densities relative to burning in the dormant season. The whole thing with dormant season fires, relative to what we talked about historically a minute ago, is that dormant season is when most modern day prescribed fires take place. And when we burn primarily in the dormant season, we're basically removing the historical disturbance and the time of that disturbance from the landscape. So deer very adapted to fire in the mid to late summer caused by lightning strikes like we talked about. When we burn in the dormant season, we get very different effects on plant communities and the quality of those plant communities relative to burning in the historical time frame, which is the growing season. Now, looking at the sweet gum problem in that light, when we burn sweet gum in the dormant season, our data indicates that you're actually going to have more sweet gum out there than when you started. And when you burn in the June time frame, you're going to be able to cut that sweet gum density in about half. It's going to vary based on, how vigorous that sweet gum's growing and how much sunlight it has to be able to send up new sprouts. But you can think of it as about 50% reduction in sweet gum stems. Whereas if you burn in the dormant season, you're going to have more than when you started, which, seems kind of crazy. You'd burn and have more of a problem species than when you started. But sweet gum is, we're talking about jack of all trades, master of none. Sweet gum is a master of competition. I mean, it's vigorous and it's widespread for a reason. It's because it's an extremely good competitor. It can grow in low light conditions. It can grow in high light conditions. It can grow in rich soil. It can grow in poor soil. I mean, it just does very well everywhere. And one of the things that makes sweet gum such a good competitor is that it's what we call clonal. So if you go into the woods, and since I've kind of got into all this fire stuff, I try to make a habit of this. When I go into the woods and I see a bunch of sweet gum stems popping up everywhere, I'm talking ones that are the size of your finger to the size of your wrist, and you just get into a thicket of them. If you look around and you kind of look at the center of that cluster of sweet gum stems, I almost guarantee you there's going to be one big sweet gum, 15, 20 inches DBH. And so all of those little sweet gum stems all around are root suckers from that one main tree. And so what happens when we burn in the dormant season, we might top kill that one main tree, right? In the dormant season, all that tree's energy is below ground. It's sitting on essentially a full tank of gas, ready to resprout with a lot of energy. And when we burn in the dormant season and top kill that one main sweet gum stem, it sends up root suckers all around it. Where you had one tree, you might end up with 5 or 10 or 15. So now all of a sudden you went from having one sweet gum that was, 2 inches DBH to now you got 10 that are a half-inch DBH. And generally from a deer forage perspective, we don't want that. That's just generally not a good thing. So, sweet gum's clonal. It responds vigorously to dormant season fire, and virtually, we kind of lumped species into 7 general response categories to fire season. And we're not going to get into all those details here today, but what's important here is that managers are kind of tailoring their fire prescriptions to site-specific plant communities and their objectives, right? You talked about the objective of timber management. If your objective is timber management and you want to reduce the hardwood midstory, and that hardwood midstory is competing with the understory, that might not be a great way to do things, because the research that's out there from the silvicultural world shows that an herbaceous dominated plant community dominated by grasses, forbs, and brambles in the understory is actually it actually imposes more of a volume reduction to that timber at the end of the rotation than a dense hardwood midstory does. So basically those herbaceous plants are soaking up more resources from your overstory crop trees, if we're thinking about a pine plantation, than a midstory would. So if your objective is just silviculture and timber yield in those loblolly pine trees and you got a dense midstory, you'd probably rather have that dense midstory than have a really well developed understory.
I'm going to maybe argue with that point, and maybe I'm not up on the most recent resource competition data from the forestry world, Luke. But I know, well, I want to cover 2 points here, but I will say that I've learned in the past from foresters that for every unit of basal area or volume of undesirable hardwoods, you are losing that much from the pine stand. So there is reason for controlling the mid-story. The issue now I don't have equivalent values for how much herbaceous plant communities affect the pine growth. I know herbaceous plants are very critical to the initial survival of seedlings. And that's why herbaceous weed control is practiced typically in forestation programs where you're planting rows of pine trees. You want to come over with a banded herbaceous weed control, because herbaceous plants matter a lot to the young seedling. I don't know, and maybe I'm just uninformed, but I'm not aware that they affect the volume of productivity at the stand level. But I also want to point out that in managing timber, if you have a mid-story, the only thing you can do is use a selective herbicide to kill it, because at the true mid-story stage, if that tree is 15 feet tall, it's probably going to be several inches in diameter, and you can't kill those trees with fire. You'd have to come in with a selective herbicide. So when we talk about fire as a part of timber management, it's a preventative prescription, not necessarily killing the mid-story per se. You're talking about affecting the mid-story before it becomes a mid-story.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of those points. I think that's a good thing to keep in mind when we're talking about managing the mid-story with fire. You know, a mid-story tree, it depends on which definition you're going with, but a mid-story tree is generally going to start at DBH height, so 4.5 feet off the ground. If it's greater than that, we place that tree in the mid-story versus in the understory, just as very rough general categories. When we're talking about managing the mid-story, I'm not talking about managing that 15-foot tall tree or 20 or 25-foot tall tree you just mentioned with fire alone. Exactly like you just said, this is more of a preventative thing where you are continuously disturbing the plant community with fire to prevent trees from ever getting to that 15-foot tall, level where they're out of the reach of fire.
So back to the forestry perspective, and a lot of landowners, that's important to have economic return from their timber investments. So we focus on deer stuff, but it matters to a lot of landowners that they make money from their timber. So it's important that they have a well-managed forest. Now, none of the three of us are registered foresters, and so we're prohibited from making specific prescriptions for particular pieces of land. So anything we talk about here, we're not saying this is a specific timber management prescription for your property. We're talking about generally here how we would manage timber ultimately for wildlife benefits. So another qualifier there.
Hey, Luke, can you come up with some general guidelines for when is it most appropriate to use fire? When would there be cases where herbicide would be the better choice? And then maybe there's scenarios where either can work. And so I'm trying to think of, there are people that either they don't want to use fire, it's just not going to be an option. And there are a lot of states where, especially outside of the Deep South, where burning is going to be very, very difficult, if not prohibited. And then we also have situations where people lease land. And so fire is just not going to be in their toolkit. Can you come up with some scenarios of where an herbicide would replace fire, and maybe some cases where fire is going to be the only tool that you can use?
Well, if you've got, like you said, if you're in a lease situation and you don't have the ability to use fire, then fire is just out of the toolbox. The other situation where fire is just totally not out of the toolbox, but you're not going to get near the response that you want, is the scenario Doc just brought up, is when your mid-story is so advanced that you can no longer control it with fire. If you want to get rid of your mid-story and promote a well-developed understory in that kind of forest, you're going to need a chemical application, just because there's no way to get rid of that mid-story otherwise. Or you could use mechanical, you go in there with a chainsaw, but still you're going to want to augment that with some chemical to prevent those trees you just cut down with your chainsaw from resprouting. So those are two, areas where, you would need to use one or the other. I think another scenario where you just need to use fire or some sort of soil disturbance in general, whether that's a disc or whatever, is very simple when you've got accumulation of duff on the forest floor. Like if you've got, 6 to 8 inches of pine straw, which might seem like a lot to people who don't spend like a lot of time in the Deep South and pine plantations, but if you've got 6 to 8 inches of pine straw on the ground, even if you go in there and remove the mid-story, you're not going to see the kind of understory response that you're looking for without exposing that soil to sunlight. And the reason we love fire so much is it's an efficient way to do a lot of this that we've been talking about all at the same time. When your mid-story is in the reach of fire, you can use the fire to top kill that mid-story tree and simultaneously remove the duff that's on the soil surface to allow that sunlight that's now penetrating to the ground to stimulate seed response and germination.
So looking back to your categories, and we're not going to talk about all 7, but maybe there's 3 categories that are most important to land managers, that in a situation where they want to get rid of something, another situation where they might want to promote something, and then there's some of the results from your work was really interesting to me, is like, it didn't matter whether you burned or when you burned, there's no impact.
Yeah.
So can you kind of talk about representative species? You've mentioned sweet gum as one you'd want to get rid of. A couple others of that, and then the other 2 categories.
Sure. So one important caveat here: the study that we're about to talk about, we did not evaluate late growing season fire in this context. So what I'm about to talk about and the representative species in each category, this is only relative to a dormant season fire, which is March time frame, which you could argue isn't dormant season here, but we're going to call it dormant season fire, and a June fire. So the one category, which is where sweet gum best falls, is the category where if you burn in the June time frame, you're going to cut that stem density in about half. And there's a lot of trees that if you burn in the dormant season or not at all, you're going to have about the same number of stems, just because they resprout so vigorously from the root collar. You're going to kill some of them, but very, very few. The ones that resprout, they're probably going to put up more stems than where they started. So there's that category. Burn in the June time frame, you cut stem density in about half. You burn in the dormant season, you're going to have about the same number as if you didn't burn at all. Then there's the category that wing sumac, for example, fits very nicely in. Wing sumac is, I really like wing sumac. It's pretty good deer food. The foliage is pretty good deer food. It's phenomenal structure. It's like this very umbrella-esque structure. Starts pretty low at the ground and tight together, and as it goes up, it branches out, and the canopy of wing sumac casts awesome shade. And it produces great soft mass for all sorts of critters. So if you wanted more wing sumac, you could burn, our data suggests, at any time of year. Whether you burn in the dormant season or in the June time frame, you're going to about double the sweet gum density that you had when you started. Or not sweet gum, wing sumac. Probably what's going on with wing sumac, very similar to sweet gum, is that it's clonal. And when you're, top killing that main stem, it's shooting up a bunch more sprouts from its root system. But it just so the difference between wing sumac and sweet gum is that when you burn in June, it has that same response as sweet gum does in the dormant season. So there's the wing sumac that no matter what time of year you burn, it's going to about double in density. And then we've got our, mockernut hickories, green ash, Callery pear. Those are 3 of the species that fall in the category that whether you burn in June, the dormant season, or not at all, you're going to have about the same number of stems. They're not significantly affected by fire at any time of the year, at least out of the fires that we evaluated. So the importance of these categories in my mind is if you've got a mid-story that's dominated by wing sumac, right, and you've been listening to a lot of fire stuff, and you really want to use fire on your property to control the mid-story and promote a really good, well-developed understory for fawning cover and turkey nesting and good deer food, etc., etc., and you've got a lot of wing sumac in your mid-story, we just want you to have realistic expectations that when you burn that wing sumac, it's likely that you're actually going to have more of it than when you started. If you've got a bunch of green ash, which is very common all throughout the eastern U.S., if you've got a bunch of green ash and you burn in the June time frame or the dormant season or not at all, you're going to have about the same number of green ash stems after a couple years that you would have if you hadn't burned at all. So that would be a great example of a situation where you would want to use a chemical application to totally kill those trees. We're not talking about just top kill with a fire. You want to totally kill those trees, because when you top kill them with a fire, they're going to resprout vigorously and very quickly outcompete the understory plants that are growing underneath of their canopy. Their canopy is going to shoot up, cast a lot of shade very quickly, and outcompete the understory. So that's a great situation where you'd want to focus more on a chemical application instead of fire.
So unfortunately, we can't just generalize and say if if we want to get rid of woody species, here's the optimal time. It's really it depends on what you're starting with, the woody species composition of what's there, and the response is going to be based on that.
Yeah, and most of the species, if you look at where the majority of species fall, most of them are in a category that you're going to reduce them with that mid-growing season time frame fire. So, if you're not great with plant ID, first of all, get better with it because it's important. But second of all, you can usually use that growing season, mid-growing season, June timeframe fire to reduce stem densities. There's not many species where a June fire increases stem density.
Well, what about, let's talk about deer now and wildlife habitat. So let's say we're in a typical scenario where, especially in the South, in the deep South, where I would say we're in a food limited system. And not just food, but let me say very high quality food. And by high quality food, I mean lots of forbs. I think we can generalize that and say most of the time that is what is limiting, or one of the limiting factors on a property. Luke, how do we go about setting up a burn rotation and timing if we're then focused on shifting and changing the plant community so that we have less woody and more forbs?
Well, the first thing you always got to start with here is how much sunlight you have on the ground. In my mind, I'm not thinking about how to make more forbs with my fire until we've already addressed how much canopy closure there is overhead of where those forbs are going to be. If you've got any less than 20 to 30% sunlight on the ground, which might seem like a lot, but it's really not that much sunlight on the ground. If you've got any less than that, I don't know that it's really worth your time to be focusing all of your energy into making more forbs when there's not enough sunlight there to really support the really shade intolerant species in the first place. Most of those really high quality forbs, like the wild lettuce and the desmodiums and the partridge peas and the ragweed and the really good stuff, those need a lot of sunlight. And your first step in this process has got to be making sure there's sunlight there. The fire thing isn't going to touch the overstory unless we're just in crazy burn conditions, and at that point, it's not even an option. You know what I mean? It's not a reasonable option. So let's just assume we've already dealt with the overstory, right, and the midstory. The first thing we're going to think about is what we're limited on, right? What you just mentioned in the deep South, it's usually high quality forbs. And when we think about fire timing in terms of forb production, our data indicates that the late growing season is the best time to burn to promote good forb coverage. So that's more the September, October time frame. Whereas if you burn in the earlier half of the growing season, the May, June time frame, you're going to get a pretty good forb response also, but you're also going to get a pretty strong grass response. And from my perspective as deer managers, especially deer managers in the deep South, are we ever really limited on grass coverage? Like, do we ever want more grasses? I don't really think so, unless we really just need help carrying a fire. You know what I mean? Because deer, they'll bed in grasses, but they're not reliant on grasses as a source of food. They're more reliant on the high quality forbs that are very limiting on the landscape. Grasses, I don't know if they're ever going to be limiting on the landscape. So we think about the early growing season versus late growing season time frame. That late growing season is going to give us the strongest forb response.
When is that forb response going to happen? You're talking about the following growing season.
The following growing season. That's an important thing to keep in mind. If depending on what critters you're focused on, if you're worried about having a blank slate and having nothing in the understory of your woods, and you burn in the, especially later half of October, you're going to get little, if any, understory response that year. So you're just going to have black on the ground until next spring green up, which is going to be November, December, January, February, 4.5 or 5 months. So if you can achieve the same objectives that you've got by burning at a different time of year, it's not necessarily best to burn in the late growing season. Now, if you burn in the if you burn more in the September time frame, especially here in the deep south where we've got plants that can still germinate into, October and even November, and you burn in September, that can be a great way to get some fresh green growth on the ground in the later half of the growing season. It can kind of augment your hunting strategy. You know what I mean? You got this fresh green growth, very high quality, when virtually everything else in the landscape that time of year is senescing. Everything else is pooling energy down into its root system. It's all going to seed or has already gone to seed. Maybe some of it's still going to flower, but those plants are not actively growing anymore and producing really high quality forage in the absence of fire.
Okay, let's take it another direction. What can also be a limitation, even though we generally don't think of it this way in the South, is cover can also be limited. And let me qualify that by saying not just cover, but quality cover. Mm-hmm. Cover where if deer had a choice, this is the place they would choose to be. So let's say you're in a scenario where you're going into a forested environment. Most of the landscape is forested such that you don't have a lot of developed cover. We talk a lot about these strategies for producing food. What would be different, Luke, if you wanted to target a particular area strategically to get quality cover on the ground? Mm-hmm. Is it going to involve just the timing of fire, or is it just a function of the frequency of the fire returned?
Well, I think both things, and this is where you can, in my perspective, you can have a lot of fun designing fire prescriptions, because there's two things, and you just mentioned both of them, that you can manipulate in this whole fire process. You can manipulate scale too, but disregarding scale. You can manipulate the time of year that you burn and your fire return interval. So how many years in between successive fires are you allowing to elapse? So if you're, really focused on making cover, you're going to want a longer fire return interval, because generally, if you want a lot of cover, you're going to want a woody thicket. That's kind of how you want to think of it. You're going to want a lot of woody plants sprouting up and branches going all over the place, and just dense woody thicket with a lot of visual screening cover. Now, that is you're generally going to get the best results on that by burning in the dormant season. So really anytime between November or December and March, you're going to get a really strong resprouting response from our data indicate all the plants that are woody and can resprout. So that includes the brambles, that includes the vines like trumpet creeper and poison ivy and greenbrier. It includes the shrubs like beautyberry and winged sumac. It includes the saplings, all the saplings that we're discussing. When you burn a dormant season where you had one stem, you might end up with 5 or 10, and just creates this nice woody thicket. So dormant season is going to give you good resprouting rates. Now, when you elongate your fire return interval, you basically just accentuate how thick that gets, because those woody plants put on more growth and new things germinate underneath. And at the same time, while we're sitting here talking about all of this, I don't want to, and I don't think y'all want either, to give people the perspective that there's anything wrong with dormant season burning in the late fall or winter or really, really early spring. There's nothing wrong with that, and it can give you great results. It'll still promote forbs to germinate, and it'll promote high quality plants in the landscape. But when we're thinking about a little bit more nuanced approach and how we can manipulate the plant community at a little finer scale, that's when we start thinking about timing in the growing season and different early growing season versus late growing season, and then fire return interval, etc. So when we're thinking about woody thickets, dormant season burning are going to give you really high resprouting rates, and lengthening your fire return interval is going to increase how thick and the visual obstruction in there. You just want to be careful that you don't end up in the situation where you let it go 3, 4, 5 years, and if you've got a bunch of sweet gum in there that grows vigorously very fast and is sitting on a big root system, in 3 or 4 or 5 years, that sweet gum is likely going to be out of the reach of fire. So now you need some chemical control of that sweet gum. And fire is, by and large, the most efficient and effective way to maintain a plant community without, warranting, a chainsaw and a bottle of herbicide or a skidder to go in. Those things are more expensive than a can of drip torch fuel. So you just want to maintain it at the right interval so that woody stuff is not escaping the reach of fire.
That was actually going to be my follow-up question. Do you end up, and I'm sure this is a it depends answer here, do you end up in a catch-22 scenario to where the interval of time to where you have produced, based in the context of your landscape, the perfect cover? This is the perfect developed cover. Have you now, when you reach that point, have you gone 1, 2, or 3 years beyond to where you can return it with fire and not need an herbicide treatment? The answer, I would think, is going to depend on, as you alluded to, it's going to be the species composition and how quickly the woody component is growing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't spent a whole lot of time in the Deep South, like Doc said in his introduction. I've been here for about 3 years, but the burning that I've done down here and the properties I've been on and seen where they've done a lot of fire at various return intervals, etc., given our growing season length, and if you just average out species composition, by the time you get to 3 or 4 years post-fire, it is thick, and it is looking like good cover. It's looking, phenomenal. It's looking like really, really good cover. And you still got pretty good species composition, too. You still got a lot of forbs, and you got a lot of brambles and vines, and you got woody sprouts. But I think when you get into that 5, certainly 6 years post-fire, that's where you really start running the risk of things getting out of reach. And weather is a huge factor. If you're planning on, I wouldn't push it too hard. If you're like 4 years, let's just say on your property, based on all the variables, you determine that 4 years is the ideal fire return interval to burn and have a nice woody bedding thicket. But at year 5, things get out of reach. I don't know that I'd want to wait until year 4 to burn. If you're confident you got a pine overstory and you've got a lot of fuel on the ground, sure. But if you wait till year 4 to burn and for whatever reason you just can't get in there and burn, like, a family emergency comes up, or the weather's just not right, or the tractor breaks down, you can't get a fire break put in, and then you got to wait till year 5, then things start escaping very quickly from the reach of fire, and it takes a lot more work. Now, we've been talking about what's in the reach of fire and what's not in the reach of fire. One of the other studies that we're wrapping up right now kind of, in my mind, sheds a lot of light on what we need to be thinking about as in the reach of fire still. When we've got a tree that it's about inch and a half diameter, DBH, so at breast level, when that tree is about inch and a half in diameter, we've got about a 75% chance of top killing that tree with fire. Which is a very good chance of top kill. 3 out of every 4 trees are going to be top killed. That's where you want to be. Now, when you get beyond that inch and a half DBH, it gets progressively harder and harder and harder to top kill those trees for a couple reasons. One is because the bark gets thicker as that tree ages and it's better insulated. But number 2, and maybe more importantly, we can touch on this in a minute, is the canopy gets farther away and gets farther up. The canopy grows higher. And scorching that canopy, our data have indicated multiple times now, scorching and all over the fire literature indicates that crown scorch is essential in determining whether or not that tree is top killed. Fire season is more important on whether that tree top kills and dies or top kills and resprouts. But crown scorch is critical in determining whether or not that tree is going to top kill. So when we're in that inch and a half DBH range and we burn, that crown is still low enough. Those flames are going to scorch the crown pretty good. They're going to discolor the leaves. The leaves are going to shrivel up and they're going to brown. And that's where all that tree's energy is. And when you scorch a crown really good, it's basically hits the reset button, and its only choice is to resprout from the root collar because you just toasted its buds and its leaves and etc. So it's not that you can't top kill a tree that's larger in the 2 to 3 inch range, because you certainly can, but then you're going to have to start getting a little bit more risque with your fire conditions, your burn conditions. So if you've got a 3-inch DBH tree, is probably going to be 12 to 20 feet tall. It's not that you can't top kill a tree like that. You certainly can, but your burn conditions are going to have to start getting kind of sketchy. really low humidity, maybe higher wind speeds. You're going to have more fuel accumulation, taller flame lengths, and then you run the risk of the fire getting into the canopy, or negative effects on your overstory trees, or jumping the fire break and getting on your neighbor's property. So, all of this that we're talking about is about how can we safely maintain the plant community in the composition and structure that we want under moderate burning conditions.
When we talk about burning as a tool, we've talked about fire season and fire timing. There's another methodological difference that we talk about, and oftentimes we have to, when we're running a prescribed fire, we need to use both approaches, and then there's combinations of the approach, but we got backfires and head fires. Mm-hmm. You want to describe the difference in those and kind of what you've learned that's, I think, new information that wasn't necessarily understood, and particularly residence time and temperature, getting into the kill range for that cambium or that mid-story tree.
Yeah, so firing technique is synonymous with ignition pattern. And basically, the simplest way to understand it is how you are lighting the fire in relation to the wind. When we're thinking about backing fires and heading fires, you're always going to light on the downwind side of your burn block. So the fire is going to be creeping into the wind, right? And the wind is going to be pushing the flames into fuel that's already been burned. So those fires are moving very slowly. Sometimes you're sitting there watching them, it's like excruciatingly slow. You're just like, oh my goodness, can we just hurry this thing up? Going so slow, but they're very safe. Backing fires are very safe. Flame lengths are very short. They're moving slowly. You can get in there with a rake and put them out, pretty easily. You can step right over them. And now let's contrast that with a heading fire. A heading fire is the exact opposite. A heading fire, the wind is pushing a heading fire into unburnt fuel. So it's like when, you're out at your burn pit or the bonfire or whatever, and you put a leaf blower on the wood on the fire. And all of that influx of air creates a really intense, really hot fire. Flames shoot up, things just get a lot more intense. Now, so where we generally kind of find ourselves in a prescribed fire scenario is a combination of those two. And we usually use, we can get into all sorts of different firing techniques here, but a very common one is what we call strip head fire. So, we'll kind of start our fire with a backing fire on the downwind side of the burn unit and let it kind of burn into the burn unit, 10 or 20 yards, whatever you feel safe with and comfortable, depending on the fuel and everything. And then once we've got that backing fire that's crept into the stand a little bit, we'll kind of jump into the stand and kind of leapfrog that flaming front by 20 or 30 or 40 yards and put in another strip that's parallel with the one we already lit. And that basically, what that allows us to do is use a head fire to speed up the process, because backing fires are so slow, it speeds up the process. But that head fire's only got 20 or 30 or 40 yards to run before it runs into fuel that's already burned up. So it doesn't allow the fire to gain a whole lot of momentum and really get ahead of yourself. If you've got a 20-acre burn block and you put a head fire on the upwind side of it, and you allow that fire to run the length of the burn block, it's likely going to be significantly more intense by the time it gets to the other end as it was when you started, because it really starts to pick up steam as that wind blows through. It's preheating the fuel in front of it, which causes it to ignite sooner, which causes it to burn hotter, which, just kind of, it's like a snowball effect. So the strip head fire really just allows us to balance how quickly we're getting done with fire intensity. So that's kind of all the background to firing technique. Now in the fire science world, there's historically been some debate on which of these firing techniques and the associated fire metrics is most important for top killing a tree. We've already kind of established that fire season, in terms of where that tree's energy is most important in terms of, is that tree going to die from the fire or not? But we think of top killing a tree, we're just thinking about the above ground portion of that tree and basically severing the connection between that tree's root system and the above ground biomass, kind of girdling the cambium of that tree. And Doc, I think you mentioned the 140 degree kind of threshold. That 140 degree is the threshold at which living tissue dies. Now that applies to, our skin cells. It applies to the cambium layer in a tree that's kind of supporting the vascular system of the tree. And heading fires, they're moving much faster than a backing fire is, but the flames are a lot taller. They're supposedly hotter. Backing fires, even though the flames are a lot shorter, maybe the flames aren't burning quite as hot as that heading fire. They're moving so slow, they're essentially cooking that tree for longer than the heading fire is. And then you've got the other side of the fire world that says, well, backing fires, some of the fire people say backing fires should have a much longer residence time, and that residence time is really critical to killing a tree. But other people say, well, head fires, even though they're moving faster, the flaming front is much deeper, right? So maybe residence time is actually the same. So which one of these actually gives us better results? And there's very, very little data out there in the literature that kind of helps us paint a portrait of this. So this is one of the components we incorporated into one of our projects, evaluating backing fires and heading fires and their ability to kill trees. And just kind of cutting straight to the results here, backing fires did increase residence time significantly longer than heading fires did. But ultimately, there was no difference in top kill or mortality rates from those two firing techniques in our study. And that was surprising to me. When I went back into the burn units after we had burned them and we'd given them a year or more to respond from that fire, I was like, man, the fires that we burnt with head fires, those trees are going to be toasted. They're going to be greater top kill rates, and we can use head fires to as this greater nuance in our fire prescriptions to really tackle this mid-story encroachment problem. But our data showed that, and very convincingly, that backing fires and heading fires produced the same rates of mid-story top kill and mid-story mortality. Which begs the question why, right? So we kind of start digging into the data more and really looking at this. And when you think about the conditions that we conducted our experiment under, we were burning on flat ground here in Mississippi. We don't have a whole lot of topography. A fire ant hill is a lot of topography here. We're burning on flat ground with very little topography. We're burning in stands that had been burned previous. Not within about 5 years, but they'd burned previously. So there wasn't a whole lot of fuel accumulation. We weren't burning in droughts, right? We weren't pushing super high wind speeds at our fires. So I'm kind of painting the picture here of moderate burning conditions. I full-heartedly believe that if we had burned under more extreme conditions, higher wind speeds, we were burning in droughts when it hadn't rained for 3 weeks, we were burning on steep topography and letting the fire run uphill with heavy fuel loading, I totally believe we would have seen greater top kill rates from our head fires than backing fires. And the reason I believe that is because our data show so strongly that crown scorch is such an important predictor of how a tree responds to fire. If you can get crown scorch 50 to 100%, you've got a really, really, really good chance of top killing that tree. But if you only scorch, 20 out of 100 leaves, probably the bottom 20 leaves on that crown, that tree's probably going to be okay. And when we think about a heading fire versus a backing fire, backing fires, they usually got 8-inch to 16-inch flame lengths, somewhere in there. They're really not putting out all that much heat. But heading fire, a lot of times you'll have 3-foot, 4-foot, 5-foot flames, and the flaming front might be 10 or 15 feet deep. They're putting out a lot of heat very quickly, strong convective currents moving up through the mid-story canopy that's very effectively scorching the crown of those mid-story trees. So, if we burn under really severe conditions and had more severe behavior or more intense fire behavior from our head fires, I totally think that the crown scorch rates in our head fires would have been significantly greater than in our backing fires, and we would have seen greater top kill rates. But because our conditions were, very moderate, which is really what we're shooting for in prescribed fire scenarios, right? We're not trying to push the envelope and burn under really severe conditions. So I believe it's pretty broadly applicable to most land management scenarios where we're trying to use fire as a maintenance tool. Now, if it's gotten away from you, and let's say you were shooting for a 4-year fire rough because you wanted that thick woody cover, and it gets to year 5 and things are starting to get out of the reach of fire, I think that would be a scenario where if you were very comfortable and you had really good fire breaks and everything was lined up, you could probably burn on a day with a little bit more severe conditions. And I don't want to use the term severe because it sounds like you're going to burn the whole forest down, but lower relative humidity, a few days longer since rain. Maybe you'd put more space in your strip head fire. So instead of a 20-yard strip head fire, maybe you do a 50-yard. You know what I mean? You're still burning safely, but you're allowing your head fires to build up more steam and get better crown scorch on your mid-story trees. When you do that, especially in the May-June time frame, our data indicate that that's the best way to whack the mid-story. So thinking about, I'm picturing a graph here in my head, but when you get really good crown scorch in the May-June time frame, our data indicate that you're going to get better hardwood mid-story mortality than when you get really good crown scorch in the September-October time frame. Okay, so crown scorch is going to better augment your fire season if your objective is killing mid-story trees. Getting good crown scorch is going to better augment that objective in the May-June time frame than it will in the September-October time frame. And I think, thinking about mechanisms and why that is, I think it's just because those trees are sitting on a relatively low fuel tank that time of year, and they're just more susceptible. They've just flushed all that energy in May and June. That it's a month and a half into spring green up, maybe 2 months into spring green up, and they've just devoted so much energy into growing new branches and putting on new leaves and growing a new canopy, and they're probably starting to flower and start thinking about reproduction. They're sitting on low, and they haven't had very much time to photosynthesize new energy to replenish their root stores. So when you burn them at that time of year, you're essentially just hitting them when they're their weakest.
Well, Luke, we're getting a lot of heavy fire management stuff, and we've talked a lot about timber management from a wildlife habitat standpoint. Back to your opening comments about historical versus prescribed fire, and you didn't really get in deep why that's an issue from a deer management standpoint here in the South. Mm-hmm. I want to cover that a little bit, and then we can transition into how we could tweak our fire plans to maximize that nutritional intake when it's needed for supporting lactation. Yeah,
so I think this is in my mind, this is one of the coolest studies that's come out of our lab in the last, X number of years. Rainer Nichols was a former graduate student here at the MSU Deer Lab, and one of the projects we actually discussed today was a follow-up on his research. But his research was focused on how dormant versus lightning season fire impacts nutrition for deer on the landscape. So think about the physiological nutritional requirements of a deer throughout the course of a year, from January through December. When spring greenup rolls around, in our neck of the woods is different by latitude, but in our neck of the woods, spring greenup is cranking by mid to late March. I mean, things are getting really, really green by mid to late March. But at that time of year, deer nutritional requirements aren't that high. Does still have several months of gestation left, and their gestational nutrition requirements aren't really peaking until the 3rd trimester. So deer nutrition and bucks are just starting to grow antlers back. So deer requirements aren't that high during spring greenup. But nutrition on the landscape during spring greenup is very high. All that new growth that's coming up, from the new buds, and new plants are germinating from the seed bank, and there's a lot of rainfall, and everything is just at peak growth rate in spring green up. That new growth is the highest quality plant material from a deer's perspective in terms of how digestible it is, in terms of its crude protein content. It's the highest quality stuff out there. So kind of starting to build this picture here, starting to paint this picture of springtime, plants are very high quality, but deer requirements aren't that high that time of year. And now kind of picture two lines on a graph that are slowly doing this and crossing one another. As you get farther into the summer, into April, into May, June, certainly into July and August, that plant quality is steadily declining. Okay, it's been months since spring green up at this point. That plant growth is no longer young and fresh. The plant cells are the cell walls are getting thicker, they're getting less digestible, there's less new growth, the protein content is lower, they're starting to senesce, they're starting to feel the effects of heat and drought in the summertime. So those plants are just, quality is steadily declining. But as we get into the April, May, June, July time frame, what's happening in terms of a deer's world? Their fawns are hitting the ground, does are starting to lactate, which is extremely demanding for a white-tailed deer, producing milk to support a single fawn, let alone two fawns. Bucks are in peak antler growth, in midsummer, they're really packing on the inches. And what we end up with is what we've kind of termed a seasonal mismatch. So by mid to late summer, deer needs are very high, but nutrition on the landscape, nutritional availability is very low. And when we burn in the dormant season, we're basically causing, that flush of new growth almost perfectly corresponds with spring green up, right? When you burn that plant and it's the dormant season, well, it's just going to green up when it had planned to green up anyway.
So historically, and in the deep south, we have some really late fawning times. And it's interesting to wonder if our late fawning times are actually tied to that early growing season fire, so that the fawns are strong into lactation when the nutritional quality was high following that growing season fire. So that's an interesting, kind of discussion over the fire pit sometime. But in terms of realizing that that's a problem, how do we go about applying fire to fix that problem?
Yeah, I'm really not much a believer in ecological coincidences. And when you see things like you just mentioned, we can talk about that more in a minute, but I tend to think that that's not an accident. So let's think about how we can kind of address the seasonal mismatch that we just laid out, talking about how, when you burn in the dormant season, or especially if you don't burn at all, we're presented with this really big seasonal mismatch. By mid to late summer, deer needs are very high, nutrition on the landscape is very low, and they might not have as much as they need to, be at peak performance. So when we burn in the June time frame, 2 to 3 months after spring green up occurs, what we're essentially doing is causing a second spring green up. Right, so spring green up happens in the March-April time frame. Those plants are starting to kind of go downhill in terms of quality. Send a fire through there, top kill everything, promote new resprouts to come up, promote new seeds to germinate, and all of a sudden we've now got another resource pulse on the landscape. Guess what? Right when deer need it the most. When you burn in the June time frame, you give it 4 to 6 weeks after that fire, when hopefully you've gotten a couple timely rains and the sun is just beating down on it. Plants are, there's still plenty of growing season left for plants to respond quite vigorously after a June fire. They're not going to respond as much as if you had burned in February, but you're going to get high quality growth responding in that July, August, even into September time frame, which is really critical when deer need it the most. Now, one of the things we can kind of, whatever direction y'all want to take it here, but when we're burning in June, our focus is not on maximizing the amount of vegetation out there. If we wanted to maximize the amount of green stuff out there, we could burn in, February, and we get lots of leafy biomass and we get a lot of new growth. Our focus when we burn in June is not about quantity, it's about quality. So when you burn in June, 4 to 6 weeks after that fire runs through an area, you get all this new growth. There's not near as much of it out there as the adjacent burn unit that you burned in February, but it's much higher quality than what you burned in February. It's going to be, 2 to 5% crude protein higher than the same exact plants growing in the adjacent burn unit because it's fresh growth. And that forage quality is much more important that time of year, relatively speaking, than the forage quantity. Now, if you've only got one bite of really high quality food, it's obviously not going to do anybody any good. But, when you're doing this at scale on, 5, 10, 20, 100 acres or whatever, you can significantly improve the nutritional carrying capacity for the deer herd on a property.
And the deer responded. Looking back at Rayner's work, the deer followed the protein quality. They were not in the stands with the most green biomass. They were in the stands with the highest quality, which was the most recently burned. And this leads into a great segue in my mind, is to kind of put this together in terms of land management. Can we talk about how to plan? Let's say a property is 200 acres. How do you plan a property, when to burn, how much to burn, how to burn? Kind of let's maybe try to put it all together for people.
Okay. So, I think there are probably some general rules or general things we can talk about here. The main thing is going to be what's your starting point? Like, where are you at in terms of, the starting point of that 200 acre property, and what are your objectives? Do you have simultaneous objectives of timber and deer? Are you focused on just critters, but is it deer and turkey? There's a lot of different routes we could go here, but, in terms of, building a management plan focused on deer, maybe with some timber mixed in, you're going to want to have burn units somewhere on the, 20 to, if you got a 200 acre property, you're not holding a deer herd. If you're super lucky, you're going to have most of one doe's home range in there. A buck's home range, you're going to need you, and then all 10 of your neighbors are going to have that. His home range is going to cover those properties. So, just be realistic in terms of what you're expecting to influence on a 200 acre property. But if you want to, do your part in a management co-op to, promote high quality fawning cover and promote high quality food when deer need it the most, and promote really high quality bedding cover and have good hunting strategy, you're probably going to want to be on that, 10 to 30 or 40 acre scale in terms of burn units. And from there, in my mind, it's actually very simple in terms of the time of year and your fire return interval. You just want diversity. You can kind of use everything that we've talked about today to do some fine tuning and get more forbs versus woody stuff, or get more grasses to carry a fire better at a time of year that it's historically hard to carry a fire or whatever. But you just want diversity. We basically want to lay out the buffet for deer, right, and put all of the things on all the plates that they could possibly need, and let them follow those resources through the calendar year. Doc, what you just mentioned, I think, is a great testament to their ability to do that. When you burn it, in February versus when you burn in June versus when you don't burn at all, in the stands you don't burn at all, those deer are in there right at spring green up. They're just hammering, like feeding heavily. When you burn in the February time frame, about a month or two after they're feeding heavily in that March burn. When you burn in June, 3 or 4 months later, they're feeding heavily there. They're literally chasing the resources across the landscape. That's kind of how I think about it. They're chasing the nutritional pulses that you're making with fire. So you just want to have varied fire timing. You want to have varied fire return interval, just to have diversity on your property. You want stuff for them to bed in. You want stuff for them to feed in. And this is kind of where it gets away from the science side of things and more to the art. Most people who are, really interested in, managing for deer on their property, more than likely they're going to walk out in the woods at sometime during November, December with a rifle in their hand. And so you can kind of use all this we've been talking about to put cover over here and food over here, and then have, low enough vegetation in the middle that was maybe burned in the mid-growing season that year for deer to cross between to get from really good cover to really good food.
Yep. I think that's a really good point, Luke, to be thinking about that. It's not just from of course, the nutrition's important, but the other component of that is, can you also arrange this with your timing and your interval, setting it up to optimize your hunting opportunities? So I think you have to think about both of those things when you're pursuing this.
I guess my closing point would be, kind of just use the stuff that we've been discussing today in terms of the impacts that fire, timing, and frequency can have on the plant community. Use that all as a starting point. And I firmly believe that there is nothing better than getting out there on your property and doing this for yourself. Do it for yourself. Learn how to identify plants. Get out there, crawl around on your hands and knees in a recently burned area. There's not going to be as many ticks, especially if you burn it in the growing season. Get out there and evaluate and experiment some. There's a lot of variability here in terms of how specific plant communities respond and time of year with moisture and topography, and that's all going to be different on virtually every property. So use this as a starting point and get out there and experiment. Burn at different times of year. Start small. You know what I mean? You don't got to burn 100 acres at a time. Start small. See what works best meets your objectives, and then do more of that.
Another qualifier, I love everything you're saying there, but there are rules and regulations and liability issues, so you don't just go out and start throwing fire around the landscape.
It's an important qualifier, yeah.
Yeah, you have to understand what's legal and how to do it in your home state.
Yep. Yeah, it's good.
Got to be legal about it. That's exactly right. Well, Luke, thank you so much for really covering that topic. I'm sure in hindsight we could think of some questions or some things we should have asked, but at least at this point in time, I think we addressed that very, very well. So appreciate your time. Appreciate everything you do for us. Thanks so much for being on our team.
Yeah,
we really appreciate it.
Thank you all for having me on.
Yeah, and I want to leave with a thought. I like to say, and we've said many times, Bronson, that if you build it, they will come. And Rayner's and Luke's research clearly shows that if you use methods of disturbance to facilitate the type of plant community at the time of the year that the deer need it, they will come and respond.
That's right. Yep.
Amen.
Deer they know what's good for them, and they're going to chase the nutrition, and if you have it on your property, they're going to find it.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.